Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hi everyone, welcome back to our series, Key Battles in the Revolutionary War. Like last episode, we're not talking about a key battle in this episode. We've gone on a sidetrack. We're looking at what's happening in Pennsylvania from 1777 to 1778, and there are a lot of things happening at this time. The Americans have to abandon their capital, Philadelphia, because the British threaten it, and then they eventually take over it. There are massacres happening. We left our Continental Army in Valley Forge in the previous episode, and there are many fears that the army is going to fall apart and what's going to happen with the British right next to Congress, almost able to basically move in and completely take over the core of the colony. So the winter is ending. Things are thawing. It is moving into spring. So what happens next, James?
All right. Well, let's talk about the enemies of George Washington. We touched on that in our last episode. There's a lot of grumbling. People are getting impatient. They're beginning to feel like Washington is not the great commander that they'd hoped he would be. He keeps losing. They seem to have forgotten about about Trenton and Princeton. Oh, that was yesterday. What have you done for me lately? So the Congress reconstituted the Board of War. We haven't really talked about this, but it's an oversight committee. The point is to be a layer between the Continental Congress and the Continental Army. And they appoint Horatio Gates as its head. And I'm sure Washington was thrilled to hear that. Yay. Gates, in turn, created an officer of Inspector General, and he planned a new campaign to Canada that was going to be commanded by Lafayette. But his real ambition was to gain Washington's position. We've talked about that at least a couple times, how Gates and also Charles Lee, who we've mentioned before, both really felt like they should have Washington's job. They were professionals. They were longtime soldiers, whereas Washington really wasn't. Gates tried to nominate a man named Thomas Conway as Inspector General. Conway had been one of the main anti-Washington agitators. Well, Washington learned about this conspiracy. It's kind of funny. He read a letter that he wasn't supposed to read, and it talked about all this. And he wrote to Henry Lawrence. Again, that's the father of John Lawrence. Henry Lawrence is the president of the Continental Congress at the time. He asked that Nathaniel Greene be made quartermaster general, and Lawrence granted that request. So again, as we mentioned last time, Greene is going to step in and do a much better job of getting supplies for the Continental Army as any of the predecessors. General Gates wrote a letter to Washington denying that he had anything against Washington. Of course, he's lying through his teeth, but Conway resigned from the army. And there's a lot more to this than that, but we don't have time to go into all the details. So basically, it was really a conspiracy that never really got off the ground. It was just a bunch of people hoping to, wishing, hoping, crying, waiting, hoping, as Buddy Holly once sang. But, and then Washington obtained the appointment of General Wilhelm von Steuben, and he came to Washington. Came from Germany. He had a letter of recommendation from, who was it that wrote the letter? Was it Benjamin Franklin? I can't remember, but he had an inflated resume. He claimed he had been a baron who served on Frederick the Great's personal staff. So Frederick the Great, this great butt-kicking, conquering king, he says, I was lieutenant general on staff of Frederick the Great, except he didn't say it in English because he didn't know any English. But anyway, Steuben made all that up. He had really been just a captain. So we'll talk a little bit more about him, but Scott, you wanted to talk some more about the conspirators?
Yeah, I just love all these freebooters who show up in wartime. Lafayette, sometimes you can get someone who's good. Other times you get people that you really don't know what their credentials are. And my historical hunch is that there's probably a book out there about all these fake freebooters who would claim that, oh yeah, I am a Italian count. I am related to the Medici family. when it's a complete and total imposter who shows up and who may have gotten command at some point. So I've read a couple of books on imposters and the sort of like the guy in the Catch Me If You Can movie.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever that guy's name is who assumed multiple personas. Abernathy, I think that's it.
I thought it was Leonardo DiCaprio.
Okay, yeah, I'm confused too. But all that to say, Frank Abernathy personas are by no means constricted to the 20th century. Imposters and are all sorts of times. So I'm sure there's a book out there. Listeners, if you know of that, please let us know. I would love to see that. But before getting too far off track, I just want to mention some other things with conspirators. The conspirators are sort of like the American domestic version of these foreign freebooters who come and inflate their resume. They're trying to jockey for position in whatever way they can, because at the start of a young nation, there's incredible opportunity that if this project is successful, could give them incredible offices and prestige. So Gates conspires with Conway, and there's other people like Dr. Benjamin Rush, General Thomas Mifflin, other members of Congress. I'm almost positive Charles Lee would have been part of this conspiracy. He was unfortunately in jail at the time still.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to get too involved.
We'll talk later that he's working some other angles that some people are suspicious of while he's there. But Rush's criticism of Washington in a letter he wrote to Patrick Henry was typical of what was being said. He wrote, "The Northern Army has shown us what Americans are capable of doing with a general at their head."
Ooh.
Yes.
Washington doesn't count.
The book that I got that from has general in all caps. I don't know if that was in the original letter for effect or not. But then it continues, "The spirit of the Southern Army is no ways inferior to the spirit of the Northern. A Gates, a Lee, or a Conway would in a few weeks render them an irresistible body of men." So he is saying that Washington is the weak link in the entire war effort. And I just thought I'd throw that in because we like these counterintuitive facts of those who don't know as much about the war. But anyway, getting back to our freebooters, our German friend Vance Joyband, how is he? Is he all he's cracked up to be or not?
Yeah, so he comes in with this fake resume and saying he was this really high commander in the army of Frederick the Great, when he really wasn't. But that doesn't mean he wasn't good at what he did. He had a talent for training. And he was exactly what the doctor ordered. He was exactly what Washington needed. He arrives at Washington's camp in Valley Forge in February of 1778, and he is like a drill sergeant. He standardizes drilling and training. He creates a model company and turns them into an outstanding unit. This is despite having almost no English. He did speak French, and so the way he was able to communicate with the soldiers is he would give orders in French, and either John Lawrence or Alexander Hamilton would, or some other officer who knew French would translate from French to English. It was really funny. Just an anecdote about von Steuben. He had this terrible temper, and everybody who's seen any movies, military movies with drill sergeants, drill sergeants are famous for their tempers and yelling at people. "Oh, you're the worst ever. Get out and give me 50 right now, dog face," and all that. So kind of think about that, but in German. He would start just swearing. He would let loose a blue streak of profanities. And of course, Washington hated profanity. Washington tried to outlaw it on more than one occasion, but he let it slide this time. First of all, he probably didn't understand it because it was in German or French, neither of which Washington spoke. But so, von Steuben would just fly into a rage and let loose all these swear words in German and French, and even some in English that he'd picked up along the way. And this actually, rather than make the soldiers scared or mad, it made them laugh. It gave them comic relief, which I know is not what von Steuben intended, but he developed a really good relationship with the Continental soldiers that he was training. Even though he was tough and would yell at them and curse at them, they would laugh, and they appreciated what he was doing, and they realized that he was making them better soldiers and a more effective army. Before long, other companies adopted von Steuben's training method, and by the next spring, the Continental Army was a much more professional army. So they go in. When they went into Valley Forge, they were very much still an amateur force. They had improved as we talked about, but they're going to come out of Valley Forge. Valley Forge is going to be a forge of character for them. It's going to be a forge of their discipline and their fighting ability. So von Steuben, like Lafayette, is going to be one of the good foreigners, one of the useful foreigners. We've also talked about Pulaski, Thaddeus Kosciuszko, if I said his name right. He was a big help at Saratoga. So not all of the foreigners that came over were just jockeying for position and money and glory and all that. Some of them actually did a good job, and von Steuben was one of them. All right, that's the closing the book for now on von Steuben. He's actually going to go on to do some commanding later, but that'll be in the future.
And also, just a thing for him as a Prussian military officer, him claiming that he was part of the staff of Frederick the Great makes perfect sense, because before Napoleon becomes the patron saint of military strategy, that was what Frederick the Great was, that he turned Prussia into this, basically the absolute summit and apex of modern military techniques. So for many decades afterwards, if you have someone like von Steuben or others who want to seek their fortune abroad, if you have the identity of a Prussian military officer, other nations that are working furiously to modernize their military will gladly accept a Prussian into their ranks. This is what happens at the same time and many years later in the Ottoman Empire, when they're also working furiously to reform their army. The classical methods no longer work, and they need regiments and modern system, modern drilling. You need drilling in order to be able to execute these techniques. And when everyone gets obsessed with Napoleon in the next century, then you have to have better regimentation to be able to do all these highly complex maneuvers. In order to train well, you need someone. Who do you get to train them? You get a Prussian. So von Steuben is sort of the early part of this Prussian wave that's going to strike all these different parts of the world.
Yes, indeed. Who was it that said that Prussia was an army in need of a nation?
Right. All other nations were in need of an army. It was an army in need of a nation. Yeah.
I don't remember the source of that quote, but yeah, the Prussians were famous for their martial prowess, just like the Hessians.
All right. So where does the next stage take us?
Okay, so we've gone through the winter of 1777-78. Now we're coming to the spring of 78. We talked about in our last episode how in the toward the end of 1777, General Howe submitted his resignation. Well, finally in April, after he's had countless parties and countless balls and countless, sessions with his lover, we'll just put it that way. Finally, in April of 1778, he got word that his resignation was accepted. Oh, yes, that resignation you sent us several months ago. We'll take it. You're out of there. So he left in May of 1778, and he was replaced by Henry Clinton. Henry Clinton is now the third British commander of all British forces in North America. So let's sketch him out a little bit. Let's talk about Clinton, do a mini biography here. Clinton's father was a British admiral who became governor of New York, where he and the young Henry moved in 1743 when Clinton was 13. He lived in New York until he was 19. So he knew the colonies, and particularly New York. Clinton became an army officer in 1746. He fought in Germany during the 7 Years' War. Who knows? Maybe he fought against von Steuben. I think von Steuben might have been a little younger, but I can't remember exactly when he was born. It doesn't matter. While Henry Clinton was in the 7 Years' War in Europe, he met Charles Lee, William Alexander, who's goes by the name Lord Stirling. He became one of Washington's most trusted subordinates. We've talked about him before. And he also met Charles Cornwallis. So this is kind of like not a reunion, because it happens before the Revolutionary Era. A pre-union? Can you have a pre-union? I don't know. This is kind of a proving ground for several future commanders in the American Revolutionary War, just like the French and Indian War was on the American continent. By 1772, Clinton had risen to the rank of Major General, and he came to Boston in 1775 along with William Howe and John Burgoyne. So again, there's that trio of Major Generals who came over to help General Gage out, and now he is the last one that we've mentioned to be put in a major position of authority. We've talked a lot about Howe. We've talked quite a bit about Burgoyne. Now it's Clinton's turn to shine, or maybe not. We'll see. He's going to try. Clinton was ordered to leave Philadelphia and return to New York. It was considered to be a safer place to be, particularly with the possibility of the French fleet on its way. So 1,500 Loyalist families in Philadelphia decided to flee with the British Army.